So welcome to the first webinar for the participants of the Preservation Horticulture Workshop. We're delighted that you'll be attending the workshop and that you will get a chance to ask any questions related to logistics after this presentation. And we're also going to have a question and answer session at the end, so please make a note of your questions as we go. There will be quizzes along the way, but the Q&A will happen at the end, so keep track of your questions. Feeling, are you there?
I'm sorry, I must have been on mute there. Let me try again.
You're fine. You're fine now.
Okay, the presenters today are myself, Fielding Link, the Alaska Region Program Lead for Cultural Landscapes, and Susan Dolan, the Washington Office Program Manager for Cultural Landscapes. Together, we have 25 years of experience in cultural landscape preservation with the National Park Service.
And today we're going to talk about the following topics to provide a foundation for the workshop next week. And these topics are cultural landscapes. What are they? How do we preserve them? How common are they in parks? How are they designated? And how do they fit with NPS management policies? How do they fit into park management? And what are the components of cultural landscapes? And how do we preserve them? And where can you find out more?
So, first of all, what are cultural landscapes? This is the NPS definition. A geographic area including both cultural and natural resources and the wildlife or domestic animals therein associated with a historic event, activity, or person, or exhibiting other cultural or aesthetic values. This is a bit lengthy, a little bit vague, so we're going to try to clarify. So, the concept of cultural landscapes involves a different way of looking at land, looking with a different lens, rather like looking at the world map upside down. It's a different way because we look first and foremost at the land in its own right. The focus is on the land as a cultural resource, rather than the land as a setting for buildings.
The term cultural landscape is a concept with a very specific meaning for the National Park Service due to our laws and policies. The rest of the world has a much larger and more flexible concept for cultural landscapes than the NPS. The NPS's definition of cultural landscapes is just one piece of the world's cultural landscapes pie.
The National Park Service meaning of cultural landscapes is constrained to something very specific, meaning only geographic areas that are eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. Cultural landscapes are listed on the National Register as sites and districts. So for us, a site and/or a district can be synonymous with cultural landscape.
In order to be eligible, these areas must have historic significance and historic integrity. Significance means importance in American history, and integrity means authenticity, being recognizably the same as during the period of significance.
The National Park Service meaning of cultural landscapes, in other words, are areas eligible for the National Register as sites or districts is much more constrained than the rest of the world that sees cultural landscapes as any land shaped by people.
For the rest of the world, this means where the imprint of people and place come together. the world may call this a cultural landscape.
For the National Park Service cultural landscapes, we are referring to the imprint of people and place and also time. Specifically, the National Park Service cultural landscapes are about people's interaction with place at a particular time, the period of significance. It's the focus on the period of significance that makes cultural landscapes a very different way of looking at land.
So back to the NPS definition, and let's take another look at it. National Park Service cultural landscapes are a geographic area including both the cultural and natural resources, the wildlife or domestic animals therein, associated with historic event, activity or person, or exhibiting other cultural or aesthetic values.
Or in other words, cultural landscapes are areas with historic significance and also historic integrity.
And even though we're just dealing with one slice of the whole world's cultural landscape pie, this concept doesn't limit the National Park Service's ability to identify cultural landscapes of many kinds. In this slide, we're looking at cultural landscapes associated with a significant event. Going from top left, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II at Manzanar. Top right, the manufacture of plutonium at Hanford for the Manhattan Project. Bottom left, Ellis Island, which was the gateway to the US for millions of European immigrants. And bottom right, the Civil War at Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania.
Other cultural landscapes were designed and may be significant for their design style or cultural and aesthetic values. Here, we're looking at top left, the modern design landscape of the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial. In the bottom left, the terrace garden of the Marsh Billings Rockefeller Estate. In the middle, the Spanish-influenced design of the courtyard at Timocacary. And right, the formal water cascade in the Meridian Hill Park.
But other cultural landscapes weren't developed according to an aesthetic design, but rather in response to functional needs. That is, according to the needs associated with a historic use. And we call these kinds of cultural landscapes vernacular landscapes. In these examples, we see on the top left the cattle ranch at Grant Coors. On the top right, the historic Buckner Orchard. And at the bottom, a water tank within President Lyndon Johnson's ranch.
Other cultural landscapes take their significance from a historic or continued association with a traditional community. Often, the traditional group is an indigenous community that has a past and present connection with the landscape that is critical to their cultural identity. However, the group doesn't have to be indigenous. It can be any traditional group. We call these types of cultural landscapes ethnographic landscapes. Here, we're looking at Puhu Kahola Heiau site, which is associated with Native Hawaiians. At the bottom left, Waiep Prairie, associated with the Nez Perce people, and Kalawao Cemetery on the bottom right, associated with the interned residents of Kalaupapa that had Hansen's disease, also known as leprosy.
So now this is a chance for you to show us what you've just learned in the first part of this webinar. We're going to have a quick quiz, just one question, but go ahead and take a crack at answering the question on your screen. So the question is, what defines a National Park Service cultural landscape? We're seeing some answers coming in here. And if you haven't had a chance to answer, go ahead and take a crack at this. Okay, if everyone's had a chance to answer, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. And then we can take a look at the results. And the majority of people got the answers correct. This was tricky in that there was more than one correct answer to this question. And the correct answers are number 1, a geographic area with historic integrity, and number 3, a geographic area with historic significance. So kudos to all those that answered correctly. The incorrect answers were a geographic area with sightseeing appeal, a geographic area of beauty, and a geographic area that's well-liked. Those may all be the case, but those aren't criteria for defining a cultural landscape. So good job to the group. Moving on to the next topic, which is why do we preserve cultural landscapes?
So these are the major reasons, and they're rooted in our primary preservation law, the National Historic Preservation Act. We do this so that present and future generations, people can experience them and learn from the past, so that communities can perpetuate their traditions and cultural identity, so that we retain the distinctive identities of place. On the photo, you can see an example looking at the cemetery in Sitka, Alaska, which conveys the distinctive qualities of its association with Russian Orthodox people.
So how common are cultural landscapes in parks?
Well, in fact, the majority of the 417 national park units have them. All historical parks have them, which is approximately 1/3 of all of the national parks. And 800 cultural landscapes have been currently inventoried, and that number increases every year. There are still another 1,200 cultural landscapes that need to be inventoried.
Well, then, moving on to the next topic, how are cultural landscapes designated?
There are various ways in which geographic areas become recognized by the National Park Service as cultural landscapes. One way is by the President using the authority of the Antiquities Act to declare a national monument. Sometimes national monuments are set aside for the cultural landscapes, like at Cesar Chavez National Monument. Another way is by an act of Congress authorizing a new unit of the National Park Service. When the new unit is a National Historic Site or a National Historical Park, the area usually contains at least one cultural landscape. Another way is by the Secretary of Interior, who has the power to declare National Historic Landmarks. When a National Historic Landmarks are comprised of a land area, as opposed to a single structure, the land area usually contains at least one cultural landscape. Another way is by the keeper of the National Register approving the listing of a National Park Service site or district. The site or district is a cultural landscape. Yet another way is by the National Park Service demonstrating to the Associated State Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO, that the geographic area is eligible for listing on the National Register as a site or district. When the SHPO concurs, the area becomes recognized by the National Park Service as a cultural landscape.
So the NPS has the most involvement with these three possibilities for designating cultural landscapes. In fact, we're the ones that usually do the research that makes the case to the Secretary of the Interior, to the keeper of the National Register, or to the State Historic Preservation Office that we think the geographic area is a cultural landscape and eligible for listing as a site or district.
So when a cultural landscape is designated as a result of being found eligible for the National Register by the SHPO, the Cultural Landscapes Inventory is usually the mechanism for making that case. The Cultural Landscapes Inventory, or the CLI, is a web-based database, rather like the LCS for structures or ASMIS for archaeological sites.
The CLI database holds an inventory for each cultural landscape in the National Park system. A completed inventory can be generated from the database as a PDF document. Each CLI is certified when the SHPO concurs with the findings of the CLI and the superintendent signs off.
About 800 cultural landscape inventories have been certified for National Park Service cultural landscapes. A cultural landscape inventory coordinator in each region oversees the work. Later, we'll identify the CLI coordinators for your region.
The contents are standardized for each inventory. Each CLI documents the history and significance of the cultural landscape and describes the extant historic features known as contributing features in a site plan and in the text narrative. And the CLI also tracks the condition of the landscape. Condition information is also shared with the Facility Management Software System, or FMSS. So now let's just break away again for another quiz question. And let's all take a crack at answering this question on the screen now. And that is, what is the NPS database used to certify a cultural landscape? Go ahead and fill that in as best you can. And if you haven't had a chance, go ahead and make your response. Alrighty, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share everyone's responses. And it looks as if the majority of people got the answer correct. The correct answer of the NPS database used to certify a cultural landscape, which is the act that makes it officially a cultural landscape, is the CLI, the Cultural Landscapes Inventory Database. Condition information ends up in FMSS, but we certify cultural landscapes in the CLI database. So good job to all of you who got that right.
So moving on to the next topic.
How do cultural landscapes fit with the National Park Service management policies? Well, cultural landscapes are affected by the cultural resource management policies, as cultural landscapes are one type of cultural resource. There are 5 types of cultural resources: archaeology, historic structures, ethnographic resources, museum collections, and cultural landscapes. And cultural landscapes are also affected by natural resource management policies, as cultural landscapes contain natural resources. And where natural resources are part of cultural landscapes, those natural resources are both natural and cultural resources at the same time.
So, the management of cultural landscapes is affected by cultural resource management policies and natural resource management policies. This is probably not too surprising. What may surprise you is that cultural landscapes are also affected by wilderness management policies, as cultural landscapes can be located in designated wilderness, and they may have features of historic value in the wilderness area, that those features can be protected and preserved in wilderness. Also less obvious is that cultural landscapes are affected by facility management policies, as cultural landscapes contain facilities such as roads, trails, buildings, and maintained landscapes.
On to the next topic.
So how do cultural landscapes fit into park management? Well, we know that cultural landscapes are cultural resources and contain natural resources, so naturally they are part of the resources management in parks. Cultural landscapes are also part of facility management when they need recurring maintenance, which is the majority of National Park Service cultural landscapes. They're also part of the interpretation and education operations, as they are shared with both visitors, formally and informally, through educational programs, interpretive waysides, or special events. And they're certainly part of law enforcement and visitor protection operations. Whether the cultural landscape is a historic parkway where rangers are monitoring driver speeds, or a historic orchard where a ranger investigates an act of vandalism. Cultural landscapes are also part of commercial services, which includes concession operations, tour operations, and tourism businesses.
So in fact, cultural landscapes are a very important part of park operations, as they are a major part of the visitor experience for enjoyment, for recreation, for education, or for traditional use purposes. So now let's break away and take another quiz question. Have a go at answering the following question on the screen. And that question is, which of the following is typically found in a cultural landscape inventory? And if you haven't had a chance, go ahead and make your response. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. And this time, we had correct answers from everyone. Everyone that responded correctly indicated that history and significance are typically found in the CLI, the Cultural Landscape Inventory, and also less of you, but still 63% also correctly answered that condition information is captured in the CLI, but we generally would not find a paint analysis. We would find that in something like a historic structures report, and we wouldn't find an archaeological excavation plan. That would be an archaeology document and beyond the scope of the CLI. So all of you gave correct answers, so well done. Let's go ahead and
moving on.
Sorry, Kit, we're just going to do one more question. Alrighty. So let's take a crack at one more question. And this question is, which of the following are cultural resources? So take a moment to answer that question. This one is a little more tricky, but go ahead and make your responses. And I'll go ahead and close the poll and share the responses with you. And what was excellent is that everyone that responded knew that cultural landscapes are a type of cultural resource. And also the majority understood that historic structures and museum collections are also types of cultural resource. Fewer of you, but correctly, realized that archaeology and ethnographic resources are also cultural resources, so that's correct. And then a smaller portion correctly answered the tricky question of historic museum storage facility. So this is conflating a couple of concepts to make it more tricky, but in fact a historic museum storage facility would be a historic structure, and so that would therefore be a cultural resource. The only one of these that is not a cultural resource is the contemporary museum storage facility, and so that one is incorrect. So congrats to everybody that got the right answers.
So now moving on to the next topic, what are the components of a cultural landscape?
So we call the components of cultural landscapes landscape characteristics and contributing features. The contributing features contribute to the significance of the landscape. Within a cultural landscape, each landscape characteristic may have many contributing features. Landscape characteristics are the stuff that was there historically and still remains today. Here on Liberty Island, you're seeing the stuff that was there historically and still remains today. We're seeing things like the statue, of course, the monument, the star fort beneath the monument, but also we're seeing the lawn, the shade trees, the avenue of trees, the seawall, all these things that existed historically that still exist today. But in examining how a landscape has changed or not changed over time, we don't use a very long list of all the stuff that's ever existed. Instead, we group them into landscape characteristics. And here, you can see the features of Liberty Island grouped under the landscape characteristics: circulation, vegetation, and buildings and structures. And once again, these components are the stuff that existed historically but are still extant today. There are 13 types of landscape characteristics possible in any kind of landscape. The landscape characteristics have associated features, and there may be as many as 13 present, or as few as 3 landscape characteristics in a landscape. But we don't think of cultural landscapes as a two-dimensional mosaic of landscape characteristics fitted together. We think of them as a three-dimensional lattice or matrix of stuff. Each landscape characteristic is entwined with the others. They have to be managed as a system. Here's the list of the 13 possible landscape characteristics that can be found in any cultural landscape. Some are intangible systems, and some are physical fabric. What's important is that where they are identified as being part of a cultural landscape, they existed historically and still remain today. If we examine the list of landscape characteristics closely, we can see that they contain other cultural resources and natural resources. In other words, cultural landscapes are multifaceted. They're the environments where lives occurred or continue to occur, and as such, they're the repositories of all traces of human interaction. Cultural landscapes can contain all of these types of resources, and by nature, their management must be multidisciplinary. Landscape characteristics are the stuff we care about. They make the cultural landscape significant, and they're also the means by which it has integrity. The significance and integrity of the cultural landscape is conveyed through the landscape characteristics. In identifying landscape characteristics of the cultural landscape, we're saying this stuff was influenced by human culture, it is significant, and it still remains.
So let's take a brief look at each of the different landscape characteristics. Natural systems and features are the natural phenomena that influence the development and physical form of the landscape. In this image, we can see the Buckner Orchard cultural landscape on the valley floor, and we identify the mountains, the Stehekin River, the valley soil, the eastern Washington climate as natural systems and features that influence the Buckner's approach to orcharding here. Spatial organization is the three-dimensional layout of the physical forms in the landscape. Here we see the spatial organization of agricultural fields in Quebec versus agricultural fields in Kansas. The fields in Quebec are rectilinear spaces based on the French long lot system, whereas the organization of Kansas fields is based in the U.S. township and range system. Land use is the principal human activities that formed, shaped, or organized the landscape. Where land use is a landscape characteristic, it is important to try to perpetuate that use to retain the integrity of the cultural landscape. Cultural traditions are the practices that have influenced the development of the landscape in terms of use, patterns of land division, building forms, stylistic preferences, and the use of materials. Here, we see a Klingit man carving a totem pole using the traditional form-line style of Native Alaskan art. Cluster arrangement is the historic pattern of aggregated features in the landscape. Some landscapes have a clustered pattern, and you can see this clustered effect in this rice-growing area of China. Now we're moving from the landscape characteristics that are system-based to those that are physical fabric. First is topography, the three-dimensional shape of the ground plane. Here you can see topographic terraces that were historically designed in the Fredericksburg National Cemetery. Vegetation is the types of plant life that existed historically that still remain today. The vegetation can be indigenous, but was used or altered by people, or was intentionally planted. Circulation is the systems of movement within the landscape. In this image, we see the historic circulation system surrounding the Lincoln Memorial at the west end of the National Mall. Here, the landscape characteristic circulation contains roads, paths, and several plazas. Buildings and structures is the landscape characteristic for the historic architecture and engineering forms extant in the landscape. A building is distinguished from a structure by being a form that shelters human activity. In this photo, you're looking at the historic food cache building at Dick Pernicke's cabin site in Lake Clark National Park. Can you guess why the food cache is elevated off the ground? Views and vistas are the ranges of vision in a cultural landscape that existed historically and still exist today. Views are broad, vistas are constrained. Here, we're looking at the discrete historic vista in the cultural landscape of St. Gaudens National Historic Site.
Fielding, I think we've lost you. think we've lost Fielding, so I'll continue. Small-scale features are the discrete stuff that made landscapes functional or aesthetically pleasing. Small-scale features are often portable, so may have been removed from landscapes over time. But where they still remain, small-scale features enrich the character of the cultural landscape with detail and diversity. And constructed water features, thank you, Fielding. We're up to constructed water features.
Okay.
Yeah.
Constructed water features are the three-dimensional forms that were built for conveying water. Here at Lyndon B. Johnson National Historical Park, the ranch retains an array of massive water tanks that were built to capture rainwater for watering the Hereford cattle. And last but not least, archaeological sites. Archaeological sites is the landscape characteristic that refers to surface and subsurface remnants, ruins, or traces that relate to the historic or pre-contact land use. Archaeological sites help us understand the bigger picture or the deeper past of cultural landscapes.
So now let's go ahead and do another quiz question. Take a look at this question. Why are landscape characteristics important? Why don't you have a go at answering that question? Select all the answers that apply. If you haven't had a chance, go ahead and make your responses. And I'll go ahead and close the poll and share the responses. And again, good news in that the majority of respondents selected the correct answers. And the correct answers here we were looking for was the second, third, and fourth response. They make a cultural landscape authentic, significant, and worth preserving. Now, they may make a cultural landscape beautiful, but in many cases, cultural landscapes can be downright ugly, and so the landscape characteristics can sometimes be ugly. So, for instance, a mining site with a bunch of slag heaps and tailing piles can be actually kind of ugly. And so that's not an important part of why cultural landscape characteristics are identified. And they may make us proud of our heritage, but sometimes cultural landscapes don't make us feel proud. There are difficult parts of our history that we preserve in cultural landscapes. And so it's not important that cultural landscapes make us proud of our heritage. So if you answered 2, 3, or 4, congrats, good job.
So on to the next topic.
Which is, how do we preserve cultural landscapes? And we preserve cultural landscapes by retaining their integrity. And this means holding on to their historic character. We retain historic character by managing the matrix of landscape characteristics. And you'll remember seeing this diagram earlier. The visual effect of the full complement of the landscape characteristics is the historic character. Management of cultural landscapes, like all cultural resources, involves 3 major stages: research, planning, and stewardship. And this process is ongoing in perpetuity. In addition, the on-the-ground care of landscapes, or stewardship, is also itself a perpetual cycle.
Stewardship of cultural landscapes involves preservation maintenance, and as we'll see next week, preservation horticulture. Preservation maintenance work is guided by research, typically the cultural landscape inventory, that describes the historic character we're trying to retain, and also by planning, typically a cultural landscape report that sets the future objectives and a treatment plan. In this photo, we see a historic pasture at Pea Ridge National Battlefield that was identified in a CLI. Guidance for mowing a visitor access route was provided by the Cultural Landscape Report. In addition to the products of research and planning, preservation maintenance is guided by the recurring condition assessments. Condition assessments provide the basis for understanding change in the landscape and what work is needed in preservation maintenance. Deficiencies identified by condition assessments are documented in both the CLI, the LCS for structures, and also in the FMSS. Deficiencies found are then addressed as deferred maintenance.
So let's now take a look at the goals of preservation maintenance. The goals are to retain the historic character by perpetuating landscape characteristics and their associated features, to repair deteriorated features, to replace historic features in kind, but also we can look at replacing missing features if we have a cultural landscape report treatment plan. And we can also look at removing incompatible features if we have a cultural landscape report treatment plan. And that's the stuff that was added after the period of significance and the stuff that visually does not belong with the character of the landscape. And we can also look at making compatible alterations and additions to the landscape. It is not frozen in time inside a bell jar. It can have alterations or additions made to it as long as those are compatible with the historic character and we have a cultural landscape report treatment plan to guide us. So now let's break away for our final quiz question and have a go at this one. What is the historic character of a cultural landscape? Go ahead and respond with any answer that applies. And if you haven't had a chance to respond, go ahead and make your selections. Now go ahead and close the poll and share your responses. And everyone did really well again in identifying answer number 1 as correct, which is true. The historic character is the appearance during the period of significance, but it also is the desired appearance to preserve. So kudos to those that got that one right. And at the very bottom, the historic character is also the visual sum of the landscape characteristics. So good job, everyone who got that right. And what the historic character isn't is the appearance after a modern makeover or the appearance that a donor desires. Really, we are looking at the visual sum of the landscape characteristics that were derived from the period of significance and still remain, and the historic character is the desired appearance to preserve. So good job to everybody who got those right.
So our final topic is where can I find out more? Your Regional Cultural Landscape Inventory Coordinator is a great source of information about your park's cultural landscapes. Make a note of the CLI coordinator for your region. If you don't have copies of the completed CLIs for your park, you can surely request them.
And you can find out more information about cultural landscapes on the web at the Park Cultural Landscapes Program's website. And the website has links to many useful materials. So that's mps.gov/cultural landscapes. And you can also find out more insider information for MPS only at the Inside MPS at the Cultural Landscapes Intranet site. But there's also a Cultural Landscapes group on the Common Learning portal, and that's where training materials and opportunities are shared. Digital copies of cultural landscape documents are housed on the data store, also known as IRMA, and you can search for all the cultural landscape documents for your park there.
Also, if you'd like to learn more about our public outreach efforts, join us on our various social media outlets about cultural landscapes. We have thousands of followers and enjoy sharing our work and your work with the public. So with that, thank you all for your time and attention, and we'll be happy to take any questions.
So I'm unmuting everyone's phone, and this may or may not work. Let's go ahead and take the first question. Out of everything we talked about, there must be some questions out there.
If you want to just type them into the box, I can relay them as well.
Don't be shy, anyone. Maybe I should pick on somebody. I'm going to mute everybody so it doesn't sound too crazy, and I'm going to pick on someone. And I wonder whether Ruben is still with us. So let's go to Ruben Andrada. Ruben, are you there? No, not hearing from Ruben. How about Ruben Limon? Are you there? Do you have a question? Anything that occurs to you that's a bit confusing? All right, let's see. Mildred, would you like to ask a question?
This is Courtney Disfield. I have a question.
Okay. Hi, Courtney.
Hi. If I am in a park and I have cultural landscapes that I'm aware of in my park, how do I get a copy of the cultural landscape inventory, or how do I know what my park has?
Well, you could begin by going to your resource manager. If you have a resource manager in your park, particularly a cultural resource manager or a resource manager that deals with cultural or natural resources, if you don't have one of those, not every park has them, you could reach out to your cultural landscape coordinator in the regional office. And so let's take another look at who those folks are. So for instance, Courtney, I think you're in the Pacific West region, and so you could reach out to Vida Germano to ask her to email you PDF copies of CLIs. But you could also go to the IRMA website, this data store, search by your park, search on the keyword cultural landscape, and you will be able to download for yourself PDFs at that link. Does that answer your question, Courtney?
It does. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Alrighty, let's go ahead and close. Thank you everybody for joining us today, and we are looking forward to seeing you next week and learning together about preservation horticulture. So thank you and have a good rest of the day.